Because we've got 3 of the world's top 10 universities and a very successful higher education sector, we have the opportunity to be a net exporter of AI-related services. And this could be a huge source of income for the UK economy going forward. But the 2 things that are holding us back is firstly high energy costs. We still are struggling to create British domicile, globally significant tech companies.
You say that Britain is well positioned, but are there things that we're still getting wrong? We last spoke, I think last November, just before the budget. Now you have a new book out, Can We Be Rich Again?, which sets out some of Britain's economic challenges and what to do about them. But we're also speaking with the prospect of yet another Prime Minister about to head towards number 10, Andy Burnham. You're optimistic about the economics and what we can do, but what's gone wrong with our politics? Can anyone actually stay in office long enough to make the changes that we need, or before they get booted out?
Well, the political system is letting us down at the moment because parliamentarians are not allowing leaders long enough to put their programmes into practice. And leaders are often reshuffling ministers so frequently that it's very difficult to see long-term policies take root. But I think, obviously, I'm not a Labour supporter, and I'm very worried about Andy Burnham's soft left worldview. But I think whether you're left or right, the crucial quality you need in a leader is someone who is prepared to persuade people about difficult choices, unpopular choices. I think too many people in Parliament think that politics is about communication. Communication, connecting with people, that can be great for winning an election. But being a good leader is actually about persuading people of things they don't want to hear. And in Andy Burnham's case, the big central trade-off, which is going to define his time as Prime Minister, is welfare reform. If he ducks welfare reform, he will have to put up business taxes, and the economy will continue to be in the slow growth lane, and life will continue to be really tough for governments, and we'll probably have more and more changes of Prime Minister. But if he confronts welfare reform and shows how it's not just better for public finances, but actually far better for the individuals involved, he could save potentially £56 billion a year within 5 years. That would mean more money for defence, more money for the NHS, not having to put taxes up on business. And we could start to see the economy growing and a very different trajectory for the country.
Yeah, but at the same time, if you're Andy Burnham and you look at Keir Starmer and his term, which is being cut short, I mean, one of the things that caused that to happen was welfare reform in a way. It was the winter fuel allowance, which was only like a token gesture that they couldn't get across the line, and that really started to weaken Starmer. So do you think Burnham's going to look at that and think, yeah, I'm up for this challenge, I can make the hard choices?
Well, I think if he is scared off welfare reform, he's misunderstanding why Keir Starmer ended up having to resign, because when he ducked those welfare reforms, suddenly people began to realise, Labour backbenchers began to realise that they had a veto on anything the government did. And essentially it made him an impotent leader, unable to take difficult choices, which is what we need from our prime ministers. So Andy Burnham, the moment he arrives as Prime Minister is when his authority is at its highest. That is the moment he can win the argument with the Labour Party. And obviously with the Labour MPs, the argument you need to make is not simply about financial savings. It's about making life better. It's about saying, you know, for people who don't have a job but have mental illness, the best thing is not to park them on benefits, but to treat the anxiety or depression, as it happens at a fraction of the cost. So there's a way you can win this argument from the left as well. But if you don't even try, then Andy Burnham's very soon going to find himself in the same position as Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves.
One particular welfare reform which I was interested in, you talk about the triple lock on pensions, which is obviously something that both sides of the aisle find very difficult to row back on. But you say that this is a moral and economic necessity, that we scrap the triple lock, replace it with something simpler. What's your view on what should happen with it?
I would like to replace the triple lock with an inflation guarantee that says that the state pension will always match inflation. It's something I've given more thought to after leaving office. The savings are not as big as they would be from the working age welfare bill. But the thing that my research uncovered and really struck me as significant is that although the triple lock has done a good job at helping to reduce pensioner poverty, and they used to be the group the most likely to be in poverty, every year that we've had it, the country has been in deficit. So what that means is that the pensioners who are benefiting from above inflation increases in their pension are seeing that partly funded through more debt on their children and grandchildren. And I think if pensioners understood that, they might think differently about whether it's actually fair.
You say there about the researches you've done since you were in office, and I suppose one of the challenges of being Chancellor, or perhaps any of these great offices of state, it's very hard. At the moment you're in there, you're surrounded by things that are going on and to think. And you say in the book that you wish you'd had it on the day you became Chancellor. What's the sort of key thing that you wish you'd known?
Well, I think that the most important thing, which, by the way, equally applies to Andy Burnham and his new Chancellor, is that politics and business, which is the world I come from, are different in one fundamental way. In the world of business, you can take over as, chief executive of British Airways, and you can spend a year getting your feet under the table, putting your teams in place, getting to know the business, formulating your plans. And then you can say, like a year later, this is how I'm going to make BA the best airline in the world. In politics, you don't have that time. Your political capital is draining away like an egg timer. And so you have to do your big things really early. So, Andy Burnham can win an argument on welfare reform or planning reform or devolution or energy reform, any of the big areas I talk about in the book, if he does it right away and in his first budget in November. If he leaves it beyond that, it will probably be too late. So those first few months are really important. Now, the job that I probably made the most progress in of the different jobs I did in politics was being Chancellor, because I made a whole series of very big decisions very early. It helped that there was a crisis. Markets were collapsing, 11% inflation, 72 billion black hole. The Bank of England saying it was going to be the longest recession for 100 years. So I took some very tough decisions both on public spending and on tax, but I took them within weeks of arriving in office. And the result was that 18 months later, inflation was 2%. We'd come out of recession. We were actually growing faster than any other major country. And although, there were structural problems left in the economy that you couldn't have sorted out in that short time period, we had made progress. But, that was because Rishi Sunak and I did some big things early. And that's probably the single most important thing I would say.
Yeah, it's interesting in the book, because you're seen as, I suppose, a safe pair of hands, that sort of a centrist perhaps, and but you say in the book, incrementalism isn't enough. You need to be radical. But I suppose people think in politics today that the sort of more radical thinking is at the extremes, the right and left. Do you think that it's possible to develop a sort of radical centrism that can make big decisions, or is it just too associated with being very cautious and doing sort of small incremental things?
I'm nervous about these labels like centrist or left or right. I think we have to be radical. And, that is, what people expect. They want politicians to make rapid progress in solving problems, and that isn't going to happen by tinkering. And, look, my personality is probably quite emollient, But I think I've shown in the jobs I've done that I'm prepared to take very difficult decisions and make the argument for difficult choices. And so I think we do need radicalism. The times where I've left office disappointed is where I haven't been radical enough. The times where I've left office proud is where I took bold decisions. Now, you can get a bold decision wrong, as my predecessor Kwasi Kwarteng did with Liz Truss in the mini budget. But I think it's really important not to confuse that with boldness being a bad thing. You know, we've got so much potential in this country. We've got 3 of the world's top 10 universities. We've got, you know, potentially we're going to overtake Japan and become the 5th largest economy in the world, although I would never underestimate the Japanese. And we've got the 3rd largest tech sector outside America and China. So we've got a lot going for us. But at the moment, there is an inertia, which is why we need bold and radical policies.
Yeah, and that's very interesting what you're saying about tech. We might come back to that, but just on boldness. So Burnham's big bold idea seems to be devolution. He wants to do things that move power away from the centre and back to the regions, to mayors. It's not quite clear what the detail of that is yet, but you talk about this in your book because you talk about this as a way to deal with some of the regional inequalities. But there are problems with how devolution has gone. So, I mean, like if we look at Scotland or Wales, say, there haven't necessarily been great economic success stories. There have been a sort of politics of grievance that's developed sometimes. What do you think is the key thing to get right with more devolution, more power to the regions to make it work better?
Well, I've long been a supporter of decentralising power.
Yeah.
I think it's very conservative, by the way, to say, you know, we're going to trust people on the ground. You know, in the education system, we gave more autonomy to heads. We got rid of national targets for the police forces in England, and both cases with good results. But we've done devolution totally wrong in this country. So in Scotland and Wales have actually grown more slowly than England since they had their devolution settlements. But that's because 2/3 of Scotland's income, the Scottish government's income, comes from a block grant from Westminster. 80% of Wales's income comes from a block grant from Westminster. Manchester, which has had Greater Manchester had more devolution than any other region in England, still 3/4 of its income comes as a grant from London. So to work, devolution needs to be funded devolution, where you're not just giving political legitimacy to locally elected figures, but you're giving them agency to solve their own problems, raise their own funds. If Andy Burnham, as Mayor of Greater Manchester, wanted a new ring road, he has to bang on the door of number 11 Downing Street and persuade the Chancellor to give him the money. And that's why Manchester's GDP per head is still only around half of London's. It's been, it hasn't been catching up at anything like the rate that people would like it to. So the biggest single thing we could do to make devolution, decentralisation of power work is to say to all local authorities, any planning decisions you make, you get to keep all the extra tax revenues generated. We would then find, whether it's big infrastructure or more housing or a new shopping centre, local authorities were looking for ways to say yes instead of ways to say no. And that would be also, by the way, very good for local democracy as well as, but it could, I think, add 0.3 to 0.5% annual GDP growth, which over time is a pretty significant amount.
Starmer and Reeves came in and they said, growth, 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 we're going to be all about it. We know how to deliver it. Never really went anywhere. Arguably, some of the tax things they did were quite damaging. How can you be sure that your ideas are better than theirs? They were very confident in their ideas.
Well, look, I think that Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves are both sincere when they said they believed in economic growth. But they were also profoundly mistaken, because for them, they believed in economic growth, but they also wanted to improve the NHS, and they also wanted to tackle inequality and support defence. And they saw all these as different priorities that occasionally you've got to choose one or the other, trade them off against each other. Whereas actually, I think if you read my book, it's very clear that economic growth is the thing you need to do first and foremost without trading off against anything else. Because if GDP goes up by 1%, the Chancellor gets an extra 10 to 12 billion pounds in tax revenues. And then you can have an argument about whether you want to use that money for the NHS or for tax cuts or for defence, but you can only have that argument if you've got the growth. And I think that, the current government were too willing. Every time there was a trade-off to be made, it was always growth that lost. And that's the thing that, must change.
You mentioned tech earlier. Let's talk briefly about AI. So AI seems to be one of the sort of very exciting new technological frontiers, something that potentially could really put some rocket boosters under growth. You say that Britain is well positioned, but are there things that we're still getting wrong? Is it energy, infrastructure building? What's going to stop our ability to really make the most of that potential that we have in AI?
Well, first of all, on the positive,
Yeah.
because we've got 3 of the world's top 10 universities and a very successful higher education sector, we have the opportunity to be a net exporter of AI-related services. And this could be a huge source of income for the UK economy going forward. But the 2 things that are holding us back is firstly high energy costs, because the data centers that AI needs are very energy intensive. And there's a chapter on energy policy in the book, but that's definitely something we need to sort out. Secondly, we still are struggling to create British domicile, globally significant tech companies. When they get to a reasonable size, they tend to want to list on NASDAQ. And that's because British pension funds only invest about 4% of their capital on domestic UK equities, whereas in America it would be more like 40%, and in Australia maybe 50%. So if you're doing an IPO in the UK, you don't get that wall of domestic pension fund money that you would get in the US or Australia. So that's what my Mansion House reforms were designed to put in place, and that's what, and actually in fairness, Rachel Reeves has built on those.
Wrapping up, I just wanted to mention something about the Treasury and how it relates to growth. You talk about this a little bit in the book. You say that Treasury officials need to find a way, in amongst all the things that they do very well, to focus more on long-term growth. And I wonder what that would actually look like.
So the thing about politics is that, short term can often overwhelm the longer term. And the thing that the Treasury revolves around every year is the budget. That's like a moment of high peril for a Chancellor, and it's when they are the centre of the national political spectrum. And, in a budget, you have to make tax and spending add up and live within your fiscal rules. And the centre of gravity in our Treasury, which is full of super smart people, is therefore its accountancy function, making sure those numbers add up ahead of a budget. Not the growth function, which is the long-term changes that will expand our productive capacity. So we need to change the internal structure of the Treasury so that the growth function has more weight than it currently has. Now, when I was Chancellor, I spent a lot of time with officials talking about growth, and they responded to that very well. But that was my personal choice as Prime Minister, not as Prime Minister, Freudian slip, as Chancellor. And I think that we need something where it doesn't matter who the Chancellor is, that growth bit always gets the attention it needs.
Fantastic. And just finally, before we finish, there was a little teaser towards the end of your book where you say you're working on another book, which is more about our democracy. And I just wondered if you could say anything about that.
Yes, the next book I'm working on is how to fix our democracy. I basically, I found in my last book, I talked about Britain's role in the world. And this book is what we need to do to sort out the economy. The question everyone always asks then is, if these are the answers, why haven't we done them? And I think that our system means it just takes a bit too long to get things done. So I want to ask some questions about how our democracy works if we believe in democracy, as I very much do, what we could do to make it function better.
Something to look forward to. Jeremy Hunt, thank you very much.
Not at all, my pleasure.